Welcome to our presentation today. This event is part of the Colombia series of the UCLA Latin American Institute. I am Ruben Hernandez Leon. I'm a professor of sociology and director of the UCLA Latin American Institute. At the controls here, as usual, we have Assistant Director Brian Pitts, who's our intermediary with the gods of tech. So hopefully everything will go fine. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome today Dr. Amy Ritterbusch, who is Assistant Professor of Social Welfare at UCLA. She has a PhD in International Relations from Florida International University. She's a recent affiliate of the Latin American Institute. And I will tell you a few things about her background, her research, and her trajectory. Dr. Ritterbusch has led social justice-oriented participatory action research initiatives with street-connected communities in Colombia for the last decade and recently in Uganda. Her work involves the documentation of human rights violations and forms of violence exerted against homeless individuals, sex workers, drug users, and street-connected children and youth, and subsequent community-driven mobilizations to catalyze social justice outcomes within these communities. Throughout her research and teaching career, she has explored different approaches to engaging students and community leaders through critical and responsible interaction between classroom and street spaces in Colombia and Uganda through the lens of social justice-oriented participatory action research. The research has been funded by the Open Society Foundations, the National Science Foundation, the Fulbright U.S. program, and other networks promoting global social justice. We're very happy to have you here, very honored to have you here, Amy. And thank you again for agreeing to present on your work. And we're ready. Take it away.
Thank you so very much. It's really a pleasure to share space with all of you today. And I will start by sharing a video. And so I hope to, from some of my movement partners and sisters in Colombia. So just bear with me for one moment. Oops. Is everyone, can folks see my screen at this point?
We can see it.
Okay. And I want to make sure that you can hear. Let's see.
9. Calladita, no me veo más bonita.
Can everyone hear that audio?
Yes.
Manifiesto 8 de marzo 2019. Calladita, no me veo más bonita. Putas, zorras, perras, lesbianas, negras, maricas, trastornadas, travestis, ñeras, visajosas, areperas, disfóricas. Todas las mujeres paramos. Hoy es un 8 de marzo, no como cualquiera. Hoy, las nadie del feminismo, estamos furiosas. Nuestra rabia sobrepasó sus buenos modales y sus discusiones académicas. No nos son suficientes. Su feminismo vainilla nos excluye. Hoy es un 8 de marzo donde las siempre violentadas nos tratamos de solo ser eso, víctimas que engrosan sus cifras e informes de derechos humanos. ¡Nunca más! Somos guerreras, luchadoras, invencibles, inmortales. Hoy es un 8 de marzo que cambia la historia, porque nosotras, las CNN, gritamos desde las esquinas donde trabajamos, desde los tacones que nos empoderan, desde las calles en las que desfilamos. Exigimos nuestros derechos. Hoy es un 8 de marzo apoteósico. Las putas gritamos desde nuestras esquinas, antros, estudios, burdeles y whiskerías. que estamos hartas de ser llamadas las mujeres de la vida fácil, porque no es fácil soportar todas las injurias de la sociedad. Yo reivindico mi sexo, mis reglas, y sí, aunque me quieran negar, también soy feminista. Y sí, soy puta feminista, porque si no puedo putear, no es mi revolución. Por eso yo reivindico mi culo, mi vagina, mi polla, mi negocio, mi local. Compañeras putas, vengan putas por sus derechos también. Hoy es un 8 de marzo soñado. Las travestis regias, como siempre, gritamos a la sociedad, a la religión y al feminismo, que estamos furiosas, somos mujeres poderosas. A las mujeres trans no nos van a detener. Nuestra revolución de mujeres empezó y no pararemos hasta que la lucha por nuestros derechos haya dado frutos. Porque esta revolución será travesti o no será. Compañeras, Maxi, venga, pelee por sus derechos. Hoy es un 8 de marzo, emocionante. Las machorras, las camioneras salimos a parar, porque nuestra sexualidad no es para el consumo masculino, porque mi arrechera no es tu cliché del consumismo. Resistimos e insistimos, porque no somos las lesbianas de escritorio ni de ONG, somos las areperas de verdad, las de la clase popular, las de los barrios, las de las plazas. Compañera arepera, vengan, cóñese por sus derechos. Por eso el 8 de marzo paramos y nos organizamos desde nuestro barrio, el Tartan Fashion. Después, desde nuestras cuerpos rebeldes, indiscretas, atrevidas y revolucionarias, porque esta manada de zorras, histéricas, maricas, guarras, areperas, putas, nos apropiamos de los insultos, porque estamos furiosas, porque nuestra lucha ya empezó y nada va a detenernos hasta que nuestro sueño por la vida digna se haga realidad. Somos malas, podemos ser peores. Somos malas, podemos ser peores. Y si no les gusta, se joden, se joden. Y si no les gusta, se joden, se joden. Gracias. Manifiesto.
So I wanted to start with the words of my dear sister in struggle and friend, Daniela Maldonado Salamanca, who is co-founder of the Trans Community Network in Bogota, Colombia. She's one of my teachers. She really is if I have learned anything about public science and about science for the people, it's definitely from Daniela Maldonado. And I'm going to share now my slides, and I have some of her words in English for you. So she says, today is the 8th of March, not like any other day. Today, as the nobodies of feminism, we are furious. Our rage overcame their good manners and their academic arguments. They are not enough for us. Their vanilla feminism excludes us. Today is the 8th of March, where we, the ever violated ones, are tired of being just that. Victims who increase statistics in human rights reports. Never again. We are warriors, fighters, invincible, immortal. Today is an 8th of March that changes history because we, the never nobody women, scream from the corners where we work. from the high heels that empower us, from the streets through which we march. We demand our rights. Because we are not desk lesbians, nor are we NGO lesbians. We are the real rug munchers, the ones of the people's class, the ones of the neighborhoods, of the plazas. And so for me, it's quite important to, when I'm attempting to connect to the philosophical underpinnings of participatory action research. So this is sort of, I understand participatory action research is the framework that informs and drives the work that I'm part of. And most of that work takes place in Colombia, where I'm originally from. And it is teachers like Daniela who have really taught me the real stuff of participatory action research, and have grounded the lessons that sociologists such as Orlando Fals Borda have shared with us in terms of the underpinnings of what Fals Borda, Colombian sociologist, terms as ciencia popular, right? Which could be roughly interpreted as public science, or science of the people, right? And so today I'm sharing a few reflections from attempts to do this work. So one of the important teachings for me from the work of Orlando Fals Borda is a term that he refers to in different texts, and also in the anthology sort of dedicated to his life and his work. So the term senti pensamiento, or feeling thinking, right, is an important concept that's central. The reason why I share with you the words of Daniela Maldonado Salamanca is because you can feel the productive rage in her presentation in this protest on the 8th of March in 2019, and frankly in any place where she shares her knowledge. And this is so important. So this term, senti pensamiento, if I can just move here, is central to these teachings, that we're not only thinking, but as we are thinking and as we are acting in different movements that we participate in, different social movements, we're also feeling, right? And that is how what different forms of participatory action research center relationship building. So one thing that I have discussed in some of my work is really the most important central piece of participatory action research in any context is relationship building with the folks that we build with, right? Keeping relationships for social justice at the center. And so it really, in many cases, is not about, the classic forms of research that we understand. It's about centering movement building for that advances justice seeking. So, for example, Daniela Maldonado is someone who I continue to learn with and from. Every time I sit down to write something or to think about sort of lessons learned from my movement work in Colombia, she comes to mind. What Fals Borda, Orlando Fals Borda, in a talk that he gave in 2002 in the National University in Colombia, in Bogota, Colombia, actually, Orlando Fals Borda founded the first department of sociology in Colombia after doing his PhD in the United States and then returning to the Colombian Academy. And definitely his tenure in the Colombian Academy was fraught with different sort of different challenges to his power, but also a lot of his work is entering into sort of reflexivity about his relationships to movements. And what he said about participatory action research, so in Spanish is investigación acción participativa. He says in this speech to the geography program that it's a life philosophy, right? And so there are many folks over the years who have who describe participatory action research as method, right? And that's the way that it's the most legible to sort of within the academy. But actually what he's saying here is that this is a way of understanding the world. It's a way of relating to people. It may be seen, what he says in this last sentence here es como un nuevo tipo de liberación social. So how can we see it as part of a project of liberation, right? Another thing I think that Fals Borda struggled with, which is something that I completely identify with, is the dominance of knowledge production in the English language, right? And so finding ways to resist, I mean, definitely upon his return to, and then contributions to what a militant sociology and just a militant science looks like in Colombia, emerging in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, is really important reflection, right? For him to return to Colombia and begin to produce and write different pieces in Spanish and think about, you know, what does the relationship between sort of notions of participation, notions of public scholarship in the global north, and then those notions and those praxis in the global south. And so Fals Borda very much saw his ideas as tied to the movements that he works with, right? And learning with, so in earlier work, Fals Borda was doing the work of working with agrarian revolution, working alongside different rural movements for justice seeking in the Colombian context, learning with those movements, producing some texts. So he was producing texts that are, you know, more ethnographic in terms of describing particular movements and how they unfold and the histories of those movements and the struggles of the people. And less maybe I think his actions, there are definitely different forms, or his movements for justice are seen in different ways. His relationship to, so the relationship of Orlando Fals Borda to different armed revolutionary movements in Colombia, and how at different moments in his career, he was, you know, accused of colluding with different armed groups. His very dear friend and colleague Camilo Torres, and his sort of tragic death in the context of liberation fighting. You know, these are the contexts that Orlando Fals Borda was thinking about, what he refers to as investigación, acción, right? So just like you can see, you know, this is an excerpt from a presentation, but also from a book that he wrote in 2003, called, the subtitle is Ideas Action hyphenated for change. And he also used that hyphen in his writing in about participatory action research to place investigación acción as hyphenated, right? It's not, we cannot separate research and action, right? And the ways that we conceptualize action can differ, right? But this is part of what he was talking about. How do we move forward toward a science that, or research and action are inseparable? So life philosophy, right? So one of his main contributions, again, which differs from sort of the ways, for example, that community-based participatory research, right? So different framings of participatory work in disciplines like public health, right? So CBPR, community-based participatory research, sort of has been seen by some movements as ahistoric, as sort of removed from the global South origins of participatory action research and movement work, but actually seeing, so there are critiques of CBPR and other forms of sort of global north situated co-optations of participatory discourse, right? In saying that, you know, sort of the language of a participatory ethos is being used to sort of continue to extract knowledge from communities, just in a participatory packaging, right? And so it's not, so making this distinction, right? We have community-based participatory research versus this life philosophy that Fals Borda was writing about, And you know, CBPR and other forms. It's not just public health, and there is great work in community sciences that does sort of think more about collective work. But in many cases, it's just has been reduced to sort of a toolkit-esque. This is how we increase the participations of communities so that they help us define research questions and collect data and analyze data. But it's still, for participation in this context still remains very much about science for the sake of publishing, disseminating, advancing knowledge that remains in the academy, instead of thinking about ciencia popular, or science for the people, that whose main purpose is to advance justice, right? And that's sort of the way that this is the way that Fals Borda imagines this life philosophy. Just to give a couple of examples. So they're definitely the work of one of the tensions that I'm attempting to think through in the literatures when conceptualizing public science or ciencia popular is, you know, different work. So Global South discussions on thinking through the work of Maria Lugones and decoloniality and gender, and also the work of Linda Tuhiwai Smith in the context of New Zealand, that imagine how can there be sort of a decolonial science or research, right? And how does this, so one of the things that I'm thinking through is, you know, are there ways to reconcile some of these movements and discussion of decolonial research and ciencia popular, and sort of looking to ways that we can learn with movements, to ways that we can sort of decenter traditional or dominant forms of doing research. And part of that, and these are just, I have some excerpts here from different texts. I want to be conscious of time, so I'm going to sort of move more quickly through these texts. But the idea is how do we challenge dominant practices? This was very much the invitation of Fals Borda, as he was talking about ciencia popular, talking about then what he calls militant research, right? Where he makes, so this is a way, how can research become a way of returning power to the people, right? And this has been said in different ways in feminist writings, right? So Bond's sort of discussion of the etymology of democracy and imagining in participatory action research, there's a lot of discussion of sort of democratizing knowledge production, right? And what that looks like. So it's, you know, if we can imagine sort of how that's also connected to, you know, some of these earlier ideas from Fals Borda. Fals Borda also mentioned in a lot of his writings, and when he, in more recent interviews before he passed, in his decision to actually leave the university, right? And his discussions of sort of his fraught relationship to universities. At one point in his career, there was actually movement sort of on his accountability to, because the way that he was sort of building up the Department of Sociology, students, sort of radical students, through his own sort of, working with folks to think through militant research, students started to come back and say, but why are we only learning a sociology? Or why are we, sort of driving these models based on global North understandings of classroom and decoloniality and, and doing research that might be seen by some as militant or radical. So Fals Borda's eventually sort of exit from formal academic space, and then also sort of simultaneously founding things like La Rosca, which was an independent press that he founded with movement family, right? To begin to attempt to publish things that are sort of more aligned with his understanding of ciencia popular. So was, which is kind of a troubling way to think about this work, how do we carve out space for these type of reflections in the academy, or is it most necessary to actually locate them outside of the academy? In my own experiences doing movement work, so before joining the UCLA community, I was an associate professor in Universidad de los Andes, which is a research university in Bogota, Colombia. And at that point, my reading of Fals Borda sort of took me to movements in street spaces. So this is also, some of these concepts also allude to the work of Paulo Freire, right? Which is, definite dialogue between the work of Orlando Fals Borda and Paulo Freire, thinking about different ways to learn from and with movements that have experienced oppression. So in those street spaces, what I attempted to do, and I want to move to my movement slide, I attempted to, at that moment, work with, I had been teaching for 5 or 6 years at that point, in Bogota, and had developed relationships with students and community members in street spaces. So, doing the work of sort of the content of our work using PAR was against police violence that was perpetrated against street-connected communities. So working with different collectives such as the Trans Community Network, like we started with Daniela's talk at the beginning. And so it was sort of my attempt to understand or sort of sympathize, create some sort of dialogue with Fals Borda's understanding of sort of towing the line between academy and movement space. We founded an organization that operated for several years. And then in the face of different forms of state persecution, we had to close the doors of that organization. And so in different places, and also tensions and infighting and interpolation of our movement within the nonprofit industrial complex, and all of these things that began to sort of wear at the social fabric of the movement. So, but this was sort of, a lot of the reflexive writing I've done is learning from this movement and from movement family, who I continue to work with and learn with, just in different ways, sort of definitely outside of the spaces of formal the formal human rights apparatus, or even, at one point, we had a program where community leaders were working with me in the classroom with grant funding, right? But even that, like these different models of attempting to move between academic and sort of social justice oriented street spaces in this context, right? That balance is never perfect, and many of us who do this work and attempt to do the work of ciencia popular, these are common threads of the critique of this and the challenges of this type of work. A lot of what sort of the public facing, I think I'm about to run out of time, so I want to just sort of give an example of one of our movements. So in militant, in ideas that Fals Borda shared with us about sort of militant research and what that looks like, is about sort of occupying public spaces without asking permission, right? And doing that with different social movements who are fighting for a particular cause, right? And how can we as sort of individuals who occupy spaces of power and can move resources from within the academy, how can we support that? So this is a movement where, so if you remember at the end of that, of Daniela Maldonado's speech, she screams, "Somos malas, podemos ser peores," which, if you can see on the left hand of this tweet, this is street art that was designed by the Trans Community Network. This particular project was supported here at UCLA by the Institute on Inequality and Democracy, but one of our sort of provocations was to use art in different ways to occupy public space, to send a message about policing, right? Through different ways of visualizing this message, particularly from the Trans Community Network. And the title of this project is Píntela que yo se la coloreo, which is, this term, it alludes to a phrase often used in sort of street fighting contexts in different urban spaces in Colombia. But what they're actually doing in this case is saying, my art is my mechanism for calling for change, for fighting for change in ways that are nonviolent, right? And these are some of the artists. This is Daniela Maldonado and Toxicomano, which is one of the street artists who supported with some of that, with some of the images and work. And so if we look at so I think another important thing about ciencia popular, for at least my interpretation of Fals Borda in all of his contradictions, right? You know, is imagining that there be an afterlife of the research that we do, right? And so is there, you know, at the very least in this project, the social memory of that message, right? Of somos malas, podemos ser peores. There's another part of that panel that is, it says, no estás sola, you are not alone, right? And those messages remain in urban space until they're erased by the state, right? What does that mean? But how can we, so finding ways, I think part of the invitation from Fals Borda or his teachings were, you know, let's find ways to disseminate knowledge, to share messages that have that sort of point toward or drive us toward justice seeking, that we're doing that in ways that remain, in ways that are visible, and perhaps even here, this is a symbolic space in Bogota, Colombia, along Caracas Avenue, which is a main thoroughfare. You know, one of the rapid bus lines goes past this, so thousands of folks pass by this space on a given day. It's also the sex work zone, or in Spanish known as La Zona de Tolerancia, which has, you know, is very problematic framing. You know, so spaces where members of this collective, the Trans Community Network, have actually experienced police violence at the scale of their bodies, right? And so what does it mean for this message to remain? I think I will conclude, if that's okay. I'm not sure how we are on time, but maybe we can open up for questions, or I can also talk about more examples, but thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amy, for your presentation. And we definitely look forward to learning more about your work and the details of your experiences using, you know, participatory action research, and thinking about the work of Fals Borda and other you know, thinkers, you know, throughout the global South. I want to take a moment to invite members of the audience to ask questions to begin that conversation with Amy. We have just some messages. Our friend Andrea Rocha from San Diego writes, recommended film, role as Historias dos Rolezinhos, a Brazilian Black Lives Matter film, talks precisely about taking over malls as an act of resistance to colonialism and globalization. So I don't know, while we see some of these questions coming through the Q&A, perhaps you can give us, you know, I don't know, a little bit more, a few more examples or other examples of your experience, how your experience in Colombia is also, you're using it now in Uganda, as far as I know, you're involved with other networks now in Africa.
Yes, definitely. And I'm kind of, you know, one of my intentions upon sort of transitioning to UCLA was also to begin learning with and supporting movements in Los Angeles. but I've found that challenging in different ways as as I remind myself of these sort of the early reflections of Fals Borda, and thinking about keeping relationship building at the center. And so it felt, for me, I'm kind of in a moment where I'm thinking about the different spaces of where I'm doing this work, and also thinking about how doing this work creates all kinds of consequences for the entire collective, right? There are like consequences of state persecution. There are also consequences of burnout. And so what does it mean to, continue to expand instead of deepen? And so what I have been thinking about lately is, the work that I'm doing in Colombia and in Uganda. I plan to continue to deepen that work, to center the relationships that I've committed to for, over a decade in Colombia, almost 15 years, in Uganda, getting close to a decade. And, what does it mean to understand one's limits as well, when really trying to do this work and think about the principles and praxis that are kind of at the center of it. In Uganda, I arrived in Uganda by invitation from local academics at Makerere University that were collaborating with different scholars in different parts of the world, and who wanted to think about sort of these dilemmas of violence in street spaces like we were doing in Colombia. And so I, as part of that, that work for me is fraught with all kinds of reflections. I love the work and the people that I share space with in the streets in Uganda. It's also really challenging to think about, the constant transitions between global North and global South. In Colombia, it's the same, really, because I'm no longer there physically, even though I'm part of a Colombian community. It's still fraught with all of these different reflections about how is the way to continue to do this work in the most committed way.
We have a question from our comment from our colleague Peter Reich at the law school. Excellent presentation. Fals Borda developed his theories based on research in rural areas, el hombre y la tierra. You have applied them well in an urban context. Going back to the countryside, can consciousness raising be carried out as effectively in rural areas where public spaces are more controlled by local structures of power? Thank you, says Peter Reich. Writes.
Yes, yes, thank you so much for that question. I think, for me, again, when it comes to context, I've also done this work I've worked in different parts of Colombia, so not only urban areas. I have done some deep work with rural river communities in El Rio Cajambre, which is on the Pacific coast of Colombia. So another sort of part of the learning that I do is just attempting to live by radical accompaniment of, social leaders. In Colombia, we know social leaders are assassinated sort of on a daily basis. This is there still are these realities of sort of threats to the life in any context, and especially in Colombia, in the context of conflict. And so I think that any context of to think about consciousness building depends on relationship building, whether it's rural or urban, or, you know, are we, you know, are we building sustainable structures of care to keep that struggle going? And that means, you know, these structures of care are not, you know, it can be supporting with resources, but it's much more than that, right? It's centering on the friendships and, you know, mobilizing, for example, the power of our different institutional spaces to support or to denounce violence and threats happening against our movement brothers and sisters and family, right? So, you know, I think that social control is happening in all spaces, and urban spaces as well, just as, you know, it's just like the government coming to sort of smooth over street art in attempts to clean up urban space, which can also happen in rural areas. I think, you know, the deep work, the question is, do we have the resources, and are we positioning our work in order to be able to show up enough in whatever space where we're working? Yeah, so that, thank you for that question. I think I'm just presenting more questions for us to think through together.
That's actually great, Amy. Dylan Dornfeld, he's a graduate student in the master's program in Latin American Studies at UCLA. He writes, "Thank you for your presentation. What specific advice would you give to future students who are looking to implement participatory action research projects? What strategies can we use to monitor the afterlife of our research?"
That's a great question, Dylan. You know, I think in terms of imagining pathways for our work, I think what's really interesting is to imagine, you know, how one of the things that we do as at the start of any sort of initiative, whether it's in a movement building space or whether it's more of something that's originating in a university space, is thinking about how are we all connected to particular social justice goals that we are articulating as part of this project together, right? So making sure that you're building projects, proposing work that is also wrapped up in your dreams and your justice seeking, right? And that in itself will align, you know, it makes it, you know, sort of just logical for the work to be done together as a collective project. It's not participation that's forced, but rather it's folks working together to reach a same justice seeking goal, right? So if you think for yourself, what are my justice seeking dreams and goals, and how can I begin to build that with a particular community? You know, so imagining, and then, you know, when thinking about the afterlife, you know, what are the ways that this work can live on as reminders that either, you know, haunt policymakers, or that, you know, continue to send a message that denounces or actually stops violence in its tracks, through not just through messaging, but through, you know, working with legal, you know, different legal structures and ways of collaborating with folks who can take this to the inter-American court system. You know, that's something, for example, that we did a lot of against in the police state in Colombia. So collaborating with legal teams and, you know, so each kind of strategy looks different depending on what your justice streams are.
Thank you, Amy. Professor Yana Shadow Hernandez at the Labor Center writes, how do you see a public university like UCLA playing a role in creating a participatory and public science research agendas that benefit the low-wage worker, youth, LGBT, immigrant communities in LA for social policy reform? And how do you, as a faculty member, challenge the current neoliberal models that public universities are embracing?
That's a beautiful question. Thank you so much, Jenna. I think I have questions, not answers. I think as someone who's on the tenure track and attempting to make my work legible for a tenure process, I'm trying to ask some of those same questions. Part of this, you know, I think, you know, it means thinking very carefully about working within neoliberal structures of funding and grant making that sort of, you know, grants that suck the life out of communities instead of actually supporting. So being very conscious of the ways that we are thinking about reallocating resources and, you know, sort of in the ways that Harney and Moughton talk about the undercommons and what is our relationship to the academy and the resources and sort of recentering toward spaces, toward movement spaces, resources, our understanding of classrooms, our understanding of infrastructures and the land that our university is on and all of these things. I think it means eventually, hopefully in our lifetimes, restructuring those spaces, even though those are dreams that, you know, how can that happen in the neoliberal academy? We'll see. And then maybe just in terms of like, you know, and I don't know whether this will be legible, but doing lots of collective writing and not that, you know, and thinking about audience is way beyond journal articles when we're talking about people's lives and social death and fighting systems that are killing our people, right? So, you know, I attempt to sit with movement family to think and write and author together and think and not just claim things in my name, which is just one small thing within that system of publishing, which isn't necessarily relevant for the people always, right? But
Thank you, Amy. Well, if there are no other questions, I want to thank you so much for your presentation. I know you came straight from class, so double thanks for the effort.